Welcome back for our final panel of the day entitled The Equity, Economic, and Policy Case for Administrative Action to Cancel Student Debt. This panel will be moderated by Dalia Jimenez, professor at University of California Irvine School of Law and co-founder of the Student Loan Law Initiative. Dalia, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us and thank you for sticking around. I see that we have over 150 people. That's fantastic. So I direct the University of California Irvine School of Law Student Loan Law Initiative, which is a partnership with the Student Borrower Protection Center and the only academic center in the country, I think still, dedicated to producing the highest quality academic research on the student debt crisis. So, and I'm really excited to be here and grateful to the Student Borrower Protection Center and DEMOS for putting this on. So in the first two panels, you heard about program-specific cancellation for students defrauded by predatory schools and for vulnerable students, including public service workers and military families. And there was a reason we started with that rather than what is more headline catchy, broad-based cancellation, which is what this panel is about, right? This panel is entitled The Equity, Economic, and Policy Case for Administrative Action to Cancel Student Debt. The goal of this panel is to think about these broader forms of student debt cancellation. But just to make it very clear, to push for something like this, broad-based cancellation, does not exclude or ignore the other types of relief available to the Department of Education and to Congress and to the new administration. We view broad-based cancellation as complementary to the other programs discussed in the earlier panels. It's not either or, it's both and. And in fact, the point of this panel, or part of the point, is to help us explore the way these approaches are mutually beneficial. So we have 6 very accomplished and great panelists today who have a lot of knowledge in this area and not a lot of time. So to save some time, I'm going to just introduce them to you as I ask some questions. And so we're going to start with Ashley Harrington, who's the Federal Advocacy Director and Senior Policy Counsel at the Center for Responsible Lending, who wrote the introduction to our Delivering on Debt Relief compendium, along with Mark Hulsman, who we hear about from later. Ashley, thank you for being here. Can you tell us a bit about what you wrote in your article and how student lending speaks to your equity work at CRL?
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And thanks for having me here today. And we were really excited to write this introduction. So at CRL, we're committed to narrowing the racial wealth gap and ending predatory lending and really helping people of color and low wealth families have real opportunities to build wealth. And part of that is ensuring a fair and inclusive financial services marketplace. That's really central to that mission. And so student debt plays into that because it is, as we watch how the racial wealth gap has persisted over time due to federal policies and federal action or inaction to actually address all of these issues. Now we have student debt both exacerbating the racial wealth gap while it's also a product of it at the same time. And so we began to look at what was happening with higher education and how we finance it. It started with looking at servicing reform and for-profit institution accountability, but really went beyond that when we looked at the real impact that student debt was having on people's ability to build wealth and for particularly Black borrowers to get that return on investment that I think most of us would expect to have on higher education. So in this paper, Mark and I really tried to delve into how we got here and just how far our higher education system has gotten away from the dreams and ideals of Lyndon B. Johnson when he proposed the Higher Education Act in 1965. The promise has really not been met. It was never supposed to be a system that was based on debt. It was supposed to be a system of grants for low-income students and students of color. It was supposed to be about access and opportunity, not debt and devastation. And so we've watched how this played out, and that was in 1965. And then we get to the Great Recession and all all of the impact that it had on communities of color. And we saw communities of color lose over $1 trillion in wealth that has never been regained, even as some say the economy has recovered and that we had bounced back before we got to the current recession and pandemic. But that was not the case. That was not the case in so many Black and brown communities across this country. And then as we entered that Great Recession and that wealth was lost, and we also saw state higher ed budgets get cut, and more of the cost of higher education being passed on to families and really burdening even more families of color, we have a real problem. And so we tried to delve into that. We looked beyond that. We looked at, how we funded or didn't fund our HBCUs historically and how we continue to underfund them. We looked at the fact that the GI Bill, which was one of the first ways that we gave people opportunities to access higher education, disproportionately didn't go to Black Americans. And so all of these things have contributed to this racial wealth gap and to the compounding of these inequities. And now we're here with a $1.7 trillion crisis that is disproportionately harming Black and brown people. And we have a need to address that. This time is not here to tinker at the margins, to play around the edges and think that that will actually provide relief to borrowers. Black borrowers need so much more than that. They need actual broad-based cancellation because this debt should have never been amassed in the first place. We should all be concerned that 45 million people have $1.7 trillion in debt, and we should be particularly concerned when Black borrowers are bearing the brunt of that crisis. And now that we're in the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing the recession and the public health consequences also disproportionately impact these communities. We should be even more concerned, right? We're going to come out of this and we don't know if and when recovery will start, and we don't know if it will be inclusive or not inclusive, but we know that part of that answer has to be doing something about student debt, because it not only will help the borrowers, it will help the economy, right? It's a twofold piece. And so thinking about the fact that, President-elect Biden in his campaign talked about the need for COVID relief, for economic stimulus and racial equity. And this is that solution that gets at all of those that he can do on his own with executive action without waiting for Congress. And so I think that is really how we approached it. And I will stop there.
And thank you. That was really great. And I just want to put another plug in for the compendium, which has the article that Alexis was just talking about, and as well as many others, and including one from Jake Brooks, who is a professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center, and also contributed a paper to the compendium about the very exciting topic of tax. And I don't mean that in a sarcastic way.
Thanks, Dahlia. And thanks to the Student Borrower Protection Center and to the SSLI for hosting this program. It's really great to be here. I'm going to be brief because there are so many important voices on this panel that we all need to hear from. But I do want to address the tax issue because it's important to the efficacy of the overall idea of debt cancellation. So there's sort of a conventional wisdom out there that the student debt cancellation would be taxable. But I think that this is based on a misreading of the history and the law on this issue. And as I said, it's critical to get this right, since a failure to do so could really undermine the benefits of cancellation. I mean, if we tax people on student debt cancellation, that essentially means that the government does not actually cancel all the debt. It only cancels some of it and then accelerates the rest. And this is also, not incidentally, a critically important issue for the success of the income-driven repayment program, where we may see very large cancellations down the road with potentially very large tax bills as a result. And it's also important to get this right because critics of cancellation have been citing the tax law as a reason not to cancel debt in the first place. But thankfully, there is more than sufficient legal authority in the existing tax law for the IRS to rule that student debt cancellation is not taxable. So first, for decades, we had a history of treating student loan cancellation as a non-taxable scholarship. Scholarships are explicitly excluded from taxation in the tax code, and the IRS correctly viewed student loan cancellation as akin to a scholarship. That appears to still be the authority, by the way, today for not taxing student loan interest subsidies and waivers. Now, the legal issue on this got a bit confused in the 70s and 80s in a way that my paper discusses, but the underlying law and logic is still sound. the bulk of any canceled student debt should be considered a non-taxable scholarship payment. Second, many government payments for the general welfare are excluded from taxation, such as housing subsidies, food stamps, vocational training, payments to victims of crime, and many other things. And the same should be true for debt cancellation. This is particularly in the context of COVID, because the tax law is very strong on the idea that a qualified disaster relief payment is non-taxable, and the COVID pandemic has already been declared to be such a qualified disaster. If cancellation is connected to the economic devastation of the pandemic, then non-taxability is clear. Third, from a tax law standpoint, student debt is actually really complicated because of the many borrower rights baked into the loan, especially the ability to fully discharge a loan by making 20 years of income-based payments. This makes it not obvious at all that debt cancellation, student debt cancellation, is equivalent to, say, reducing mortgage or credit card debt. It's even questionable to me whether an income-driven repayment student loan would be considered debt for tax purposes. So for these and other reasons, the IRS has the authority they need. Now there's a precedent on this. So the IRS has already created a safe harbor against taxation for borrower defense discharge, where that safe harbor is based on the fact that there is a series of legal arguments that would likely apply to almost all the relevant borrowers, even though the IRS couldn't necessarily say for sure which argument applies to which borrower specifically. But they said the sum total of all the arguments is sufficient for us to decline to assert taxation. The situation is even clearer here, in my view. Borrowers have multiple strong legal arguments that any student debt cancellation should not be taxable, and the IRS should make that clear. Thanks.
Thank you. It's really important because, I mean, we've got to, I think part of what we can do here, as you know, with all the experts we have in the room, is to really examine both how do we make this happen and what are the effects of it, as well as the potentially good effects, the potentially negative effects, and the ways in which we could ameliorate some of those potentially negative effects. Thank you. So I want to tackle some of the elephants in the room that we started with. We started with Ashley talking about the student, how student debt has really exacerbated the racial wealth gap, and how it has let down a lot of our Black, particularly Black, but also brown borrowers in this country. And one of the reasons given against broad-based cancellation is that the racial wealth gap is actually not going to be decreased. It's that it's going to be exacerbated. So sort of the opposite, right, of what we're talking about here. So Joanna, I want to ask you if you have any thoughts on that, and whether you think that does the research actually support that interpretation? I'm sorry, and Joanna, I should say, Joanna Derekis is a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. I forget, I have to introduce every time. Okay, Joanna, please.
Happy to be having this conversation with you all today. It's vitally important that as we think about debt cancellation, we really lean into how necessary it is to move for broad-based debt cancellation. That is the pathway to equity here. So if we want to reach the very borrowers of color who are struggling with student debt right now, we have to make sure that we don't leave them out. And that means if we want to carefully target them, we have to cast a broad net. And that means that that's how we'll make this program effective. We've heard all day today about programs that have been narrowly targeted and still haven't met their mark, have still failed to deliver relief. And being efficient and effective here is the way to get the relief to Black and brown borrowers. And that's why we need to pursue broad-based debt cancellation. When I think about the ways in which some have said that broad-based debt cancellation would potentially exacerbate the racial wealth gap, got to remember that we are talking about we have to, a lot of times the conversation about wealth and income get conflated. And we really, really want us to stop looking at means testing as a way to make debt cancellation more equitable when we're looking at income as a proxy for wealth, because they're different. And we're really talking about not just how much money someone's earning today, but about whether their family has historically been deprived the opportunity to build wealth, to get high earning jobs, to access higher education. So canceling debt in a broad way is how we would make sure that Black and brown borrowers, the people of color who have taken on a disproportionate burden of debt, will be well served by this program and by the policy behind access to higher education in the first place. If you've got a mountain of debt in the first place, then that's not really what affordability is, and it will certainly impede the ability to build wealth. Here, being inclusive is the way to address the racial wealth gap. And it's not the only policy we need to implement to address the racial wealth gap, but this is where in the student loan space, to the extent that student loans have been a driver of the racial wealth gap, and to the extent that income and family wealth doesn't protect Black borrowers from facing default and the negative consequences of borrowing, we need to make sure that we do what we can do in the student loan space and cancel the debt. That doesn't mean that we don't need to continue talking about reparations. That doesn't mean that we don't need to continue to talk about wholesale policies that will also invest directly in the Black community and in people of color. But broad-based debt cancellation is a good start, and it's something that's immediately actionable in the student loan space.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually a great point as I want to transition to the broader question of sort of the regressivity argument. Both when making those arguments, people who make them, generally speaking, are in the racial wealth gap argument, they're basically ignoring all the other possible things that might be done and saying, like, this isn't going to solve it. Like, well, not one thing is going to solve it. It is, hundreds of years in the making problem is not going to be solved by, something that is so, in a way, small relative to the larger problem. But it is a step in the right direction. So another argument that often comes up, and in fact is probably, if you just Google student debt cancellation, one of the first, all of the articles that you get at first are about, well, it's regressive. It's not a good idea because it's gonna not help. It's gonna help more the people who don't need the help. And there've been lots of articles making this claim, although looking at who's written them, I'm not really sure that those people would be supporting any kind of debt cancellation. But they would just be arguing, so it's sort of I don't know if it's it seems a little disingenuous, but I'm an empirical researcher, and so I want to pose the question to Alexis about data and whether there is data supporting the view, or whether or the contrary. Alexis Goldstein, who's a senior policy analyst at Americans for Financial Reform, what do you think?
Thanks so much, Dahlia. Yeah, I think my short answer to this is no. Federal Students Act cancellation is not regressive, and the data does not bear that out. I think the main mistake that people make when they approach this is they're looking at amount of debt instead of number of people who are helped and where those people are on the income quintiles, right? Are they in the top 20% or the bottom 80%? And to sort of Joanna's earlier point and Ashley's earlier point about $1 trillion in Black and brown wealth just being completely lost in the years after the Great Recession, right? Income is a bad proxy, right? We should be talking about wealth, but we have the income data. So that's unfortunately what I'm going to be using. But if you look at $50,000, just to pick a number, of students at cancellation, if we did $50,000 of students at cancellation, 80% of people in the bottom 80% of incomes would have their debt completely eliminated. That is not true for the top 20% of incomes. They would only about half of them would see their debt completely eliminated. And there's also very particular benefits to people who are in default, who we know, generally speaking, are lower income people. A lot of people are in default on extremely low balances. The highest numbers of people in default are people who borrow a relatively small amount, which is less than about $6,000. And so even if we did a $10,000 in student debt cancellation, you would actually eliminate a huge amount, the majority of amount of people who are in default, who are suffering these very punitive, terrible consequences of default, like huge debt to income ratios, trouble getting jobs if employers are checking their credit. Sometimes you have your driver's license or even your professional license suspended. So again, the key mistake that people make is thinking about where the debt is and how much debt people have. And so yes, there are wealthy people that have a lot of debt, and maybe there's a lot of debt in that one wealthy quintile that gets eliminated, but that's not looking at the sheer numbers of people and the meaningful differences in their lives. A few other numbers just to put out here, and this is one actually compiled by Mike Pierce of the Student Borrower Protection Center using someone else's data, but 57% of people who are currently unemployed, so the sort of COVID unemployed, 57% of them have attended at least some college. And that's another just thing that people don't think about when they think about student debt. I think they have this picture in their mind. It's someone who went to college and lived in a dorm. There are so many people that have different experiences. Maybe they have a 2-year degree. Maybe they did not complete. There's a lot of different experiences that people have with higher education. And more than 40% of people with student debt do not have a college degree. So either they are a non-completer or they have an associate's degree, but 40% of people who carry debt don't even have a college degree to show for it. And to the sort of racial disparities that Ashley was talking about earlier and Joanna was talking about, right? We know when we talk about regressivity, student debt itself is regressive in that way, right? Because Black borrowers need to attain higher levels of credentials just to get the same income levels in many cases of white college dropouts or white high school dropouts, right? So student debt itself is almost regressive. And so what does it mean to say that canceling some of it would be regressive? Like, you need to sort of ask the question at the right point of the problem. But I do think that student debt cancellation is not regressive when you just talk about the sheer numbers of people that it would be helping. And I do think that that is the right way to think about it and to approach it. And just to put one more finer point, because I'm talking about income quintiles, which is a little abstract. So people in the bottom 80% of income, right? You cancel $50,000 in student debt, 80% of them have their loans wiped out. That's people with less than $111,000 in income, just to put a little more precise of a note on it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Some of these arguments just don't seem as sort of serious, I think, when we really examine them and when we look at the actual data. But there had been these two numbers thrown out, the $50,000, which is actually Senator Warren's proposal. I think there's a bill before Congress, and then the $10,000 that President-elect Biden has promised before. How do we balance that, Mark Hulsman, who's the Associate Director of Policy and Research at DEMOS, one of the co-sponsors of this conference? Thank you. How do we balance this sort of, number, broad-based cancellation with the program-specific cancellation that the earlier panels discussed? Can we do it all? Do we need to do something first?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Dahlia. I mean, the short answer, and I promise not to drone on too long, is we can do both. We can walk and chew gum, and frankly, we should. So obviously we've had kind of a whole half day here on improving existing programs, thinking more creatively and aggressively about them. That work is essential. It's hard. It's years-long work, and it sets us up for success going forward. The more we can sort of make those programs work and work well for borrowers who frankly deserved relief yesterday. What I think is kind of interesting about this often is like, there's this narrative around, or that sort of sets this up as oppositional views, right? Like cancellation gets posed as pie in the sky, program specific gets proposed as responsible, or the adults in the room. And like, what I think is funny is that, it's often framed as responsible or sensible to expand or highlight or provide better information about existing programs. But we're like on our 9th iteration of IDR at this point. Like, issues with PSLF have been well documented. We're closing out an administration that viciously threw sand in the gears for borrowers who had applied for and deserved every drop of relief under BD, right? To the point that many have spent half a decade or more waiting or begging for relief long after their schools closed even. So like, this stuff is hard and necessary to untangle, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's no more reasonable to say that we should improve existing programs than it is to say at a time of extreme economic precarity that we should actually start over, and that for many people the risk has simply overshadowed the benefit, that 2 generation defining recessions in 10 years should make us err on the side of going bigger, having a reset, while we sort of, continue to improve the system. I think broad student debt cancellation does a couple things. One is that sort of ideally, and depending on how you do it, as Alexis was talking about, it gets rid of the debt or almost all of it for people who were most likely to default, fall behind, otherwise have to wait 2 to 3 decades for forgiveness or cancellation when they could have gotten it now. 2, as I mentioned, it sort of amounts to a reset and an admission that what we assumed about this financing instrument was not true, especially for Black and brown borrowers. And it moves us towards a policy conversation and a system going forward that, in which student debt, to the extent it does exist, is more humane, it's predictable, it's reasonable, it's frankly a choice instead of an obligation. And by and large, if we have broad-based student debt cancellation tomorrow, right? Depending on if it's 10, it's 50, it's all of it even. There either may be some debt left, and even if we do the right thing and invest in debt-free public colleges and make sure that we, eliminate every dollar of unmet need for people, there will be some future debt from those who maybe attend private colleges, maybe some graduate programs and so forth. And that's why we need the ability and sort of an aggression in canceling debt using existing programs in case future Congresses, administrations, states, institutions fail to deal with predatory actors or act in a way that are actively harmful to borrowers, which might sound familiar given that, we are still, in an administration that has done that for the past 4 years. So, I think the debate going forward is quite interesting. We have some really great proposals on the table, whether that's $50,000, whether that's $30,000, whether that's all of it. Ensuring the tax code is where we think about wealth distribution, a flat amount for everyone, an additional cancellation for those, in certain classes, incremental forgiveness, which has been mentioned. But I think that, given the persistent legacy of discrimination and wealth stripping from Black and brown families, the fact that, white households, even those with student debt, right, consistently get wealth passed down from older generations, and middle income Black and brown households specifically have just a fundamentally different financial picture. I think we can hold 2 thoughts in our head at the same time, that we can do a sort of reset, particularly given the economic situation, particularly given this crisis, particularly given what we've seen over the past decade or 2, and have the tools going forward to be able to nip this problem in the bud if it comes along again.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I just want to pick up on your point about this notion that the program-specific cancellation is the responsible thing or the adult in the room type of answer. But it ignores really, some of the people that Alexis was talking about, those who didn't graduate or those who didn't, who basically have really small loans that are not worth pursuing, that are really just, it's a waste of money to go after them and resources and, psychologically detrimental to those individuals to both have those loans and be pursued, for them. And that's not the adult in the room. That's just being mean, right? That's just wanting to punish people. And that really doesn't seem, just like a good use of anyone's time, really. And so, to the extent that argues for some, just really erasing the debts of people with small dollar, especially if they started with, some of them may have started with $5,000, but now their debts may be much larger actually. And so they might need those 50,000, even if they actually only spent, 5,000, this would be helpful, particularly to those individuals who, to talk about regressivity, are obviously, who needs to borrow to go to college or to go to a certificate program. It's primarily Black and brown borrowers because they need to, because they don't have the wealth to look to, right? And then when they are in trouble because they are, because those programs aren't good, or whatever other circumstances, don't have the wealth to fall back on to pursue, to be able to repay those. And so it was as Alexa said, regressive from the beginning. You know, and in particular, the programs and the broad cancellation would help those who probably need it the most. So I have sort of one other question to introduce the last person who hasn't gotten to speak yet, Luke Herron from Yale Law School, who wrote an article earlier last year detailing the authority that the Secretary of Education has to do a lot of these things that we've been talking about without necessarily going through Congress. And so Luke, I wonder if you'd give us some context about where we are now, you think, on cancellation versus where we were 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. What has changed, and does it, I think for me, it makes me hopeful, but you know, what makes you hopeful about progress regarding cancellation, but also more broadly about what Alyssa talked about in the earlier panel, about how we're gonna deal with this going forward. You know, whether, you know, cancellation, you know, is it just about cancellation? Do we think the movement is just for cancellation, or for also, you know, not requiring people to incur massive amounts of debt before they can get a degree?
Thanks, Dahlia. Hi, everybody. Thanks to the Student Borrower Protection Center and to Demos for hosting this event. You know, maybe the best way to start answering this question is to say it's kind of surreal that this event is happening at all. My experience working alongside some folks here, including Alexis, is that, you know, I've been talking about student debt cancellation along with a bunch of folks from the Debt Collective and post-Occupy formation since 2015, and a lot of folks talked about it before. And in that time, it was crazy, ridiculous to even say student debt cancellation was a possibility of any sort, even to say that for-profit college students should have their debts all wiped away. So anyway, that's surreal, and I think that gives us a sense of the trajectory if we go back even before 6 months ago. I would say it's worth, before going through the sort of historical trajectory and where we are now, articulating why I think student debt cancellation makes sense, and try to cut the issue in a different way than to talk about just regressivity or progressivity, because the way that regressivity and progressivity are often conceptualized is as a way of characterizing a set of statistical aggregates, you know, where on the income spectrum relief is targeted. And so in that way, it treats student debt as basically just one among multiple aspects of a household's balance sheet. And the only relevant moral question is, how do we make these balance sheets more equal? And I think that is, of course, a relevant moral question, but it seems to me that the reason to cancel student debt should be more indexed to the question of, do we want to have a higher education system that puts people in debt? Do we want to condition the ability to access education, which really should be a basic human right? It's a basic aspect of human curiosity, creativity, of socialization, of working, of learning and being together in a democracy. Do we want to condition that on being indebted? And do we want to condition so much of well-being in our society on having an education? So the fact that the higher education system has been turned into basically a way that you make money, and then you go into finance and make a lot of money, for instance, is a corruption in some sense of the higher education system. And so to cancel student debt is best understood, in my view, as progressive to the extent that it dismantles this way of doing higher education and this way of organizing the labor market and the distribution of income and wealth. And so in that sense, I see student debt cancellation as a non-reformist reform, or best viewed as, or ought to be tried to be oriented towards being a non-reformist reform. That is a reform that is organized towards dismantling the way that we've organized higher education and employment and income distribution in the country. And so that, I mean, we can go on more about what that would mean, but I think that is a different way of asking the question of progressivity and regressivity than, you know, now we look at people's income bands, we look at people's wealth bands, you know, how does this leave people relative to, how does this leave the whole spectrum relative to what it was before? I think that's a very narrow way of understanding it. And thinking about student debt cancellation more broadly is also, in that way, also allows us to conceptualize it as, would student debt cancellation, this issue was raised up earlier, would student debt cancellation change the way people think about higher education, change whether they think they ought to be paying this debt, whether this debt ought to be incurred in the first place. That's a fundamental change that has only really recently happened as recently as like the 1990s, that people thought taking on debt to go to a higher education was a natural thing. And so can we start to change the way people organize themselves politically and think about higher education? So that way of thinking about things is the way that, you know, I come out of, and the way that the reason that I've thought through these ideas, and the way that the movements that brought these ideas to the fore understood these ideas. So I think in part that was inherently crazy, because the nature of the debate 6 months ago was people who thought the system was mostly working just fine. And even people who are sort of towards the left end of what I would call mainstream policy discussion on higher education, the thought was the system is working just fine, except for-profit college students and students who have not completed their degrees, right? And that was actually a relatively recent innovation as of 2 years ago, to even acknowledge at the bottom end of people, it's actually not worth taking on student debt. It was always just like, well, on net, it's a benefit to go to college and take on debt. The notion of canceling debt just didn't make sense in this whole framework. I think now we're at the point where increasing numbers of people are recognizing that student debt both is actually actively harmful, a net wrong for a lot of borrowers, and that what a lot of people have highlighted so far, that there's been such a repeated series of program failures that these incremental measures, even if in theory they're good ideas, which I mostly don't think they are not gonna happen, because they don't alter the dynamic of the political dynamic that reproduces the student debt system that exists today. And so there's a notion of, first, borrowers have just repeatedly wronged, let's wipe it out. And second, now we have to do something. Maybe I'm speaking too long, but the last thing I will say is that I think the moment, that's still like the left end of the discussion now, of the mainstream version of the discussion now. I think the center of it, people like, why is Chuck Schumer pushing this? Is basically because he wants a way to stimulate the economy that doesn't require going through Congress, and to do it quickly, which is like pretty opportunistic in a good way. I think we should just take advantage. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we're getting a lot of these debates, is like, this is not that great a stimulus relative to other possibilities, and this is not super progressive relative to other possibilities. I think that's true. Like, I think other medical debt, housing debt or rent payments are a lot more impactful on lower income folks in our society, and that like other reforms would be first order better. But we're in this sort of this world of figuring out what we can do given the political forces now. So it's in some sense, it's like mismatching the nature of the debate with the nature of the political situation in which the debate is happening. But it seems like more and more people are getting on board. And so I would say I'm very hopeful. One thing that makes me very hopeful is to see something like Jim Clyburn saying, well, yeah, this might have legal challenges, but we have lawyers too. That's somebody who's not a super radical person saying something like, we have to go big, we have to take a legal risk, which if you had asked me 6 months ago if that was going to be part of the mainstream of the Democratic Party, even, I would said absolutely not. Even if Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders had been elected president, I would have thought there would be resistance. So it's a potentially very hopeful thing that, just due to sort of a number of circumstances that we're in now, we'll see. I think we haven't seen the full force of the backlash yet, and so we'll see how that looks. So enough for me.
No, that's really, I'm now going to open it up shortly, and there's I know a lot of a lot of things have been raised by people earlier that folks want to talk about. Let me start with this idea of the simplicity of cancellation, broad-based cancellation, and the complexity of the programs. I think Alexis wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Dahlia. I think, so one of the things that's so beautiful about this as a solution is it's very easy to understand. And I think one of the failures of, financing student, education through debt has been how complex it's become. You need to hire an accountant almost in order to help you navigate all of these different systems. And we've seen so many failures of some of these systems that have been set up in order to try to provide relief to people. Public service loan forgiveness, I think, is a big one, right? There's so many people who should be eligible for that who've now applied and are getting denied after 10 years of public service and are not getting the cancellation that they're owed. We've seen the failure, I think, with the for-profit colleges and their collapse, and the borrowers who, again, by law, are owed a cancellation of their debts because they were defrauded. And I would argue that the Obama administration's hesitance to give a group discharge, a group cancellation of everyone who attended those schools where they knew the harm occurred, their hesitation to do it that way and their insistence on an individualized person-by-person application left tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of borrowers vulnerable to the Trump administration and to Betsy DeVos, who then came in and shut it all down, rewrote the rules, denied people, gave them no relief or partial relief. And so I think complexity in any policy sphere favors the powerful generally and the wealthy, right? Because they can hire the lawyers, they can hire the experts to help them navigate the system. And people that don't have time for that just don't apply for whatever relief is available. And so cancellation is simple. It's easy for people to understand. I think that's part of the reason why we see its popularity. But I think it also will be more effective than some of these other programs because it won't require people, hopefully, depending, I suppose, on how they implement it. But hopefully, I would argue this should not be an application specific thing. And the last thing I'll say on this point is student debt is unique, right? Student debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. Dahlia, I don't need to tell you about this, right? But you're the expert here on that.
Technically it is. It's just very hard.
Right. Undue hardship. I'm sorry. Thank you for the correction. But, it's treated more harshly than other kinds of debt and gambling debt. And I think it is also a kind of debt that is held by the government in larger amounts than any other kind of consumer debt. And it's simultaneously the second largest kind of consumer debt out there, second only to mortgages. And so in my view, if the government does not use this very clear authority that they have to provide relief in the middle of a pandemic, with 57% of the people who are COVID unemployed having some kind of student debt, if they don't use that tool, to me, that is an irresponsible, abuse of power in a way, or like failure to use the power that they have. And so I think that to me is what drives the urgency, I think, behind, right? Sort of like to Luke's last point, right? Of course, it's not a perfect solution. It's not a panacea, but it's a tool on the table, and the table's pretty empty right now of other tools. So let's pick up the tool and use it.
Yeah, thank you. I think Luke wanted to follow up on that.
Can I add something to you after Luke?
Oh, yes. Yeah, sorry, I lost. Yeah, there you are. Sorry. Go ahead, Ashley.
No worries. I'll just piggyback on every wonderful thing that Alexis just said. But I think also with IDR, I think, NCLC did a FOIA, right? That over the past 5 years, where people should have gotten IDR forgiveness, 19 people have. So you're asking people to rely on a system that literally does not work. And you're also, it's really problematic because you're asking Black and brown people to rely on that system. You're telling Black and brown people, oh, just wait 20 or 25 years and then you can get your life on track. There is something inherently wrong with saying that, because you know who is impacted by whether this system works or not. And so when you put up these barriers, you're putting up barriers for, like Alexis said, not just well-resourced people, but also disproportionately white people. And so Black and brown people are the ones who are left out. And so if we want to do something about all of these things, we have to keep that in mind, make it as easy as possible, make it as broad as possible, and give people the relief, not just that the numbers say they need, right? Like, people are asking for relief, right? And they're not asking for IDR. They're asking for cancellation because they see how it's impacting their lives and stopping them from doing other things. And we should want them to have that relief because we know that it's stopping them from doing other things, and that impacts our economy as well.
Yeah, on that point, I just want to take a prerogative as the moderator to say that I think, and to piggyback on what Luke said earlier about, just the larger point of this being potentially a catalyst to rethinking how we think about what education, how the government should fund or encourage higher education, is that, I think this has sort of been a mistake, right? To do it this way, whether it was intentional in the beginning or whether the reason why we kept putting more and more loan programs instead of grant programs, instead of funding Pell, to higher amounts, was because potentially because basically more Black and brown people were wanting to get higher education, or whatever, lots of other political reasons. It was a mistake. And now we know this. And so it's sort of like, we're still asking students, just like in the context of students who've been defrauded, to bear the burden of a political mistake, and a burden that is unequal, and that is just, and then if they want to sort of ameliorate that burden, we've given them these IDR, et cetera, other programs, and all these hoops to jump through, just like we do for welfare and basically every other program for middle and lower income people, because they need to be deserving, and they need to prove that they're deserving before getting these very basic things. Whereas, the tax code, et cetera, makes it easier for others, whether it's because they have resources or actually because there's less hoops for them to jump through to actually obtain those benefits. Anyway, I want to just open it up. I know I want to open it up to anybody who wanted to jump in here on anything that's been said, and then we'll go from there.
I'd love to make just like a really small point about the sort of regressivity argument, and it's something that's been bothering me since March, among everything else. It's that, the use of this argument would make sense if people, sort of making the regressivity argument either fought just as hard to build out an alternative that met whatever definition of progressivity they've chosen, but that, like, also, by and large, the pause on student debt payments, as part of the CARES Act, and the continued pause and the forbearance is generally agreed to be a sensible idea. I mean, I know that there's some, I'm sure that there are some people out there who don't think it's a good idea, but by and large, I mean, there's a pretty bipartisan consensus that, like, stopping student debt payments was a sort of necessary piece of the recovery, or at least a good piece without, need for much complaint. But if you're making the argument that student debtors are primarily a well-off class of people, you should actually be alarmed at this. You should, you're giving a monthly break to wealthier households, right? But no one's alarmed by this, because we genuinely recognize it to have been a necessary step in the middle of a pandemic, where, as Alexis said, people with some college are, by and large doing very poorly in the economy. 50% of people with some college have lost income since March. And I would submit it's a couple of reasons for that, where there's not this outcry about, the regressive nature of the student debt payment suspension. And it's because it was understood to be a part of a larger economic recovery package, which speaks to the need to, talk about student debt as one of the many things we need to do, even if there is a tool that we can use right now, because people needed relief quickly and in a bunch of different ways. And because for some reason it's not understood to be cancellation or quote unquote forgiveness, right? And that's not a policy question, that's a political question. There seems to be this sort of political or moral, like, reticence to do cancellation or forgiveness when you're doing sort of, or considering doing other things that have the sort of same effect on, the sort of income or wealth distribution, right? So, I don't actually know where that leads us, but it is something that I've just felt the need to get off my chest, because I think, we need to sort of have people remain consistent in this. And if they're bothered by, broad-based debt cancellation, and we can talk about the particulars here, right? We can talk about what's a sort of like reasonable way to go about that, but you're not bothered by, like, quote unquote wealthy student debtors not having to make their monthly payments now, I think it's time to look inward.
Just one quick thing on that, because I don't want people to come away with the student debt suspension is bad, right? The student debt suspension is very good. I think the lack of criticism is people were so surprised that Trump, of all people, would do this. And I think that creates a bar that Biden has to clear, right? There has been now some $40 billion and counting in student debt relief that has gone to borrowers that came about because of the Trump administration. And so Biden needs to do, at a minimum, that much relief, but really needs to go, I think, a bit higher. And then one other thing I wanted to throw in is there has been cancellation of debt, but it's been cancellation of student loan interest. And so we've already done it. And Trump has already done it via executive action. And I just think that that's important to remember.
Yeah, and any arguments they might have had that this couldn't be done by administrative action, they've ceded there. Luke, I think you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, well, I just want to make two quick points. One is, I think it's also really worth thinking about the baseline here. And this maybe is a different way of stating something that I already said, which is that, like, for me, the question, like, often the baseline is the status quo, and how are we going to do, and how should student debtors be made better off or worse off, or which student debtors should be better off or worse off than the status quo. But to me, there's like actually a prior moral question, which is like, why is it morally justified to put like people into debt for higher education? And just to sort of frame that in a particular way, like the argument seems to be, you know, education is too good for people. They need to be burdened. Like, we need to, like, you know, Harrison Bertrand, we need to like put weights on people once they get an education. And like, the reason that education is too good is that, like, the way the employment, like the way that we've designed who gets which jobs and which jobs are paid what, and this is like a relatively recent development, like really over the past 40 years, it is, you know, strongly favors people who go to certain types of schools. And like, that's a different problem. That's not saying like, well, you know, in order to say that it's okay for people to have debt, and simultaneously it's okay to order who gets which jobs and how we order income through the job system that's highly tied to a very hierarchical higher education system, is to say, like, actually it's totally fine that like 40% of the graduating class of elite, first of all, that there are elite colleges at all. Second of all, 40% of them are going to work in finance, which is like a fundamentally extractive project. Like, that's fine. That's actually efficient, right? That makes things go well for everyone. We just have to like do this like highly targeted tax, and like that's somehow how student debt works. And I just think that's like wrong. This is wrong on so many levels. And so it's like worth pushing back on the sort of even the moral framework that's being assumed is. And for instance, that applies to like this. Now we're definitely going to see more of this argument. We just saw this argument in the New York Times come out that it's moral hazard to cancel student debt, because then now people are going to take on more debt thinking that it's going to be canceled. And from my perspective, it's like, if people think that's going to be canceled, that is a good thing. Like, people should stop thinking about this as a legitimate thing. And the notion that in order for that to be problematic, you have to think that it's actually fundamentally a good thing that this thing continues to keep going. And I just don't think that. So that's like a different moral baseline thing. All right. And the last thing I would say is there's this false choice between student debt cancellation and other forms of relief that also is required to be assumed if you're going to, like, when people say stuff like, you know, student debt cancellation is highly regressive, they usually mean relative to X, Y, or Z other social program. And like, from my perspective, the only reason that works is if you think those two things are possible to do at the same time. If you think there's like a limited budget of like good things that can be done, and that requires a theory of like political capital that like everything that you do that's progressive somehow like is a negative sum relationship to other good things. And to me, there's actually the possibility that people don't really consider that actually doing more good things makes it possible to do more good things in the future. And that should be something that we should get used to creating the possibilities for. So canceling student debt might well create a constituency for free college, for canceling medical debt, for, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So
that's actually, I want to just open it up to anybody who wants to talk about how it might do that. I mean, one thing about it is if the Biden administration jumps in and on day one cancels the $10,000 that they spoke about, or some other number, do we think that helps or harms or sort of begins the conversation of like, well, you know, it's not that that I will take on student debt now thinking it will be canceled in the future. It's why am I taking on student debt now? Why am I being forced to do this, as opposed to not going through that whole thing if it will ultimately be canceled in the future? Why isn't the government actually funding this?
I mean, my very quick response to that is I do think that the way that the Biden campaign at least has contemplated their 10,000 has been as a pandemic response. And so I would encourage people to think about it in that way. I do, however, think it does open up room for these more interesting questions that you raised, Dahlia, right? And I think that conversation is one we have been wanting to have for a long time. And so I think it's sort of a win-win, right? It's like, we're going to do this thing that's a tool on the table that's going to be a pandemic response. And hopefully it'll lead us to ask these bigger questions. That's my real quick response.
Yeah. I have one last question I want to ask, but I don't want to jump into that unless, you know.
I know, I'm sure I'm not the only one with thoughts.
Yes.
I'll just jump in and say, I really appreciate that Luke is taking us to the point of looking at debt-free college going forward. That's the companion measure here. And that is something to which the Biden administration has already made commitments as well. So when we think about debt cancellation, I want to be thinking about about maximum debt cancellation. Let's cancel as much debt as possible. And the Biden on the campaign trail made multiple campaign promises related to different amounts of debt. So $10,000 off the bat, but other campaign promises could be accomplished early on at the same time by increasing the amount of debt that gets canceled through executive action. And the more debt we get off the books, the more problems we solve. We are talking about all of these targeted programs that haven't delivered relief in the past. And if we are moving to a world where students don't have to take on burdensome debt going forward, then when we're looking backwards at folks who've already borrowed, clearing as much debt off of the books as possible frees us up to also get rid of problems in the past, servicing abuses, paying debt collectors way too much money to collect and harass people who just can't afford to pay. We can get rid of those systems altogether if we just clear the books of the debt. So if we want to envision a new world, a different world, that's the world that this administration has promised that they would kind of herald. And we are here to help them make that happen. Like there may be roadblocks, but we're here to clear them. And I'm really excited about the conversation we're having now.
Yeah. Anybody else want a last word before I ask the last question? Okay, so the last question I think has been asked at every panel, which is given, that we have so many people watching and so many people who will watch this as a recording. And, given where we are, we're talking about this sort of great opportunity to sort of change the way that we think about higher education funding, to fix some past mistakes, and to make sure that we don't make them in the future, and to cancel things other than student debt potentially. Give us and everyone watching some homework. What work needs to be done? What work do you hope people will do to move debt cancellation forward? And y'all can look at anybody who wants to start.
I feel like I'm talking too much, so sorry. Just real quick. So we need to hear from you, and members of Congress need to hear from you, and the public needs to hear from you. And so if you are part of any kind of an organization, maybe it's a church group or a religious institution or a community group or a school group or a professional association or a union, whatever kind of group it is, if you all believe that student debt cancellation would be beneficial to your membership, saying that publicly right now in this moment would be very helpful. I think there's this sense about, like I said earlier, who borrowers are. That's wrong, right? It's this ivory tower sort of belief, and it's just not true. And so maybe it's a letter to the editor, maybe it's calling your member of Congress, maybe it's just talking to your friends. But I think talking about this issue, if it's something that would be beneficial to you or to people you love, right? Because it's not just about like the individual, it's about the network effects. I think that would be really, really, really helpful in this moment.
One thing I'd like to say, it's not homework so much as just maybe a broad.
Oh.
Everybody on this panel and probably everybody.
Oh no.
The language of debt is part here. We sort of, brains have sort of been broken by trying to think about this in terms of.
Is it just me, or we're having trouble hearing? Maybe if we all turn off our.
But I think I'm hearing.
Okay, yeah. Or if you turn off your video, like maybe so that the.
My connection's bad. I'll just leave it there. Sorry.
Sorry, Luke. I think you wanted to jump in before.
Well, I was just going to say, just to add on to Alexis, I'm going to say it really genuinely very quickly. If this is going to be a positive sum situation where canceling student debt leads to other things, that's going to, the Biden administration is not going to do that itself. The Democratic Party is not going to do that itself. And you'd better believe the Republicans aren't going to do that at all. So getting involved in doing organizing, there's actually a fairly broad coalition of folks who are doing this. Like being part of that coalition building around student debt cancellation ideally creates a coalition that is also ready to do medical debt cancellation, free Medicare for all or other forms of free care. We don't have to think about this as how policymakers are thinking about this. If you're part of an organization, you can be building a coalition that tries to build the positive sum, positive feedback effect. So that's all.
Anyone else?
I'll just offer that I think what you're all hearing from this panel today and what you've heard from the panels before is that we are a group of folks who are looking for solutions. We are here because we can see the problem and we have clients, we have constituents, we have friends, we have family who unfortunately are telling us heartbreaking stories about what their student debt means and for their lives. So because we can see the problem, we're looking for solutions and we're solution oriented. There are a lot of naysayers. There are a lot of folks who aren't trying to be part of the solution. And I would say, help us drown them out. Help us answer the tough questions. Help us take on the research and make the case for debt cancellation, because we know that it will solve so many problems. And that's what we're after. Being the change that's necessary because people have had these unmet needs for relief for so long.
Yeah. Ashley well, Jake already tried. Okay. So I want to give the last word to Mark as co-sponsor of the entire conference. And thank you to Mark and Demos and SBPC. And please take it away.
Wildly inflates.
I'm sorry. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you. It's been great.
I was going to think of it. Dahlia, that wildly inflates my power or responsibility over this event. I actually really want to thank the Student Borrower Protection Center, really the whole team, right, who worked incredibly hard to put these amazing panels together, cobbled together an incredibly powerful volume at protectborrowers.org that digs into, the weeds of a lot of the stuff discussed today in detail. I have really enjoyed digging into those papers. I have learned a lot of stuff that I did not know before, and actually plan on cozying up over the holidays to it again. So that's my plug for the volume. Logistically, I'm told that the recording for this event will be available next week for those who maybe missed the panel or were doing other stuff for different parts of the day. I know it's been a long but really rewarding day, so the recording will be available next week. Of course, thank you to Senator Elizabeth Warren for kicking this off today in a way that only she can. And just sort of like to conclude, I want to go back to something that Seth actually said as we started the day, and I wrote it down. He called out the unconscionable reticence to provide relief by the people who broke the system, and I found myself applauding that. How could you have sort of brought us to this moment and then balk at what is, I think, a very sensible idea, which is provide some broad-based debt cancellation and make sure that going forward that people have the tools to cancel a debt that they never should have had to take on, were suckered into, or what have you. But as a ray of hope, for those of us who have been in this discussion and in this fight for the last several years, this genuinely feels like a different moment to me. And I think that's a number of reasons, right? There's a different moment because of the genuine crisis in our economy. It's a different moment because of the political leadership that we've seen from Senators Warren and Schumer and Sanders and Reps Presley and Omar and Pocan and Jayapal and Clyburn and more, and President-elect Biden, whose campaign promise of broad-based debt cancellation marks a pretty seismic shift and an opportunity, as we've been talking about in this last panel. It's a different moment because of the tireless work of many of the panelists today, doing creative legal work and policy research, trying to untie some really tricky policy knots, working with borrowers, organizing, working with advocates and activists at the national, state, local, student, borrower, institutional level. you know, and that matters, right? That's what brings us to this moment, I think, as Luke was saying before. And it's a different moment because of the millions of people who have stood up to protect and center Black and brown lives and build Black and brown power over the past year. This past year, we've seen the leadership of a racial justice movement, frankly, that questions a lot of the failed assumptions behind our economy and our safety net. It asks us to sort of build a future that isn't based on exploitation or debt, where success isn't precarious, where predatory actors aren't lurking behind every corner, but actually where we can dream bigger, we can expand public goods, we can make the system, frankly, work for this generation in a way that it did work for previous generations of Americans who looked a little bit different, but who could rely on and count on robustly funded higher education, you know, a Pell Grant that met the cost of college, and where debt was not, you know, the central way to finance school. And I would submit that if in the year of our Lord 2020, if we're truly at a moment of reckoning about the way racial injustice permeates our economy, I don't think you can stand idly by on student debt. So what I'm taking away from today is that we need to think big and specific. We need to push for broad cancellation and give relief. Yesterday, I think someone said, you know, day minus 100 before to those who were defrauded half a decade ago, whose only crime was getting an education. I don't think we can reiterate that enough. And whose government, frankly, said for decades, trust us. This is a program in a school with our seal of approval. This is good debt. Go for it. You know, you'll be fine. And as this conversation continues, I think, you know, I want to ask that we remember that these things aren't mutually exclusive, as I was talking about before. This is a problem that's big. It's $1.7 trillion big. It requires a whole suite of solutions. And these things, whether it's BD, PSLF, IDR, what have you, can work and should work in tandem with broad-based debt cancellation. So with that, I think I have the last word. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around the past few hours. Thank you again to the Student Borrower Protection Center. Thank you to the leadership of DEMOS, especially our president, Sabeel Rahman. This is an exciting time, but amid the excitement and the wonking out and the push forward and the, you know, the many acronyms we've spouted out today, I hope everyone has a really restful weekend, a safe holiday season and New Year, and take care of each other.